Hello, company, and welcome to the Show People podcast, the podcast that shines a spotlight on the UK performing arts industry and those dedicated to their craft. I'm Andrew Keates. I'm a director, artistic director of queer theatre, and your host. Now, today's guest is nothing short of a national treasure. A celebrated writer, actor, director, comedian and broadcaster. His remarkable career has spanned theatre, film, television and radio. He's a best-selling author, one of the most beloved voices in British culture, and has recently been knighted, recognising his services to mental health and the environment. It is an immense honour to welcome to the Two Brewers stage, Sir Stephen Fry.
Bless you, bless you. Oh no. Stop it, stop it. Stop it, stop it. Oh, you have. Oh, nice to see you all here.
My first question, Stephen. Mm-hmm. Have you ever been to the Two Brewers before?
No, I'm ashamed to say it's my first time. I'm thrilled. It's a legend. I've heard of it. Everybody who's even slightly, just even QUE, without even the following E and R, will know about the Two Brewers. It is one of the best-known sort of gay, queer icons in London. There used to be a comedy club somewhere near here called Jongleurs. Is that still going?
Jongleurs, yeah, which then became a franchise, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. That's right. That was the closest I came to here because... I mean, South London, with all respect.
Steady.
You know, there's upstairs and there's downstairs, and one feels we are, or maybe I should put it in your terms, we're in London's backstage area, shall we say.
Of which I am an expert. Upstairs and downstairs.
Yeah.
Now, your love of language is extraordinary, and I wanted to know, can you pinpoint the origins of that love?
I can, actually. Well, there are two moments in my life when I realised that language was something that I was going to, appropriate to myself in a way that was very special. The first was when I was sent away to boarding school when I was 7, 200 miles from home. I grew up in Norfolk, but my prep school was in Gloucestershire. And so I arrived as a little 7-year-old, a little scared, hoping to be loved, as all children and all adults, let's face it, hope to be loved. And I soon realised that I wasn't going to be loved because everything that was of value in this school, I was hopeless at. Most importantly, first and foremost, was sport, athletics, any kind of sporting thing. And I was one of those completely uncoordinated children. You know, if someone threw a ball at me, I would sort of clap my hands at it instead of properly. And I couldn't run in a straight line. I'd collide with a tree and I'd trip over the white lines on a tennis court. Words were thrown at me that are deeply unpleasant. And I thought, oh, well, that's no good. But I couldn't sing. I couldn't dance. I couldn't draw, I couldn't paint. I thought, that's it. I'm just going to be the little weed in the corner that everybody ignores. And then there was a music lesson, ironically, given my, inadequacy with music. And the teacher wrote on the blackboard, orchestra, and obviously he was going to tell us all about the different sections of the orchestra. But I squeaked out, cart horse. He said, what? And I'd looked at the word orchestra and I'd just seen the letters rearranged into cart horse, which is, a very basic anagram. There's nothing particularly remarkable about it, but he was rather astonished. He said, do you do this a lot? And I said, well, yeah, I sort of do. And in fact, through my life, it's a great gift to give people anagrams of their names. And I remember once with Steve Jobs, this wasn't with his name, it was a good name drop, but I did know Steve Jobs quite well. And I was in Cupertino, where Apple have their headquarters, and he and Johnny Ive were bringing out one of the new MacBooks and in the laptop line. And I was saying, laptop machines are very interesting. He said, duh. I said, no, laptop machines, really interesting. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, laptop machines is an anagram of Apple Macintosh. Oh. He said, get the fuck out of here. I said, no, it truly is. And I wrote it up on a whiteboard and I wrote, laptop machines and pulled the letters out into Apple Macintosh. And it's a perfect anagram. He said, you're fucking weird. There was another occasion, also name dropping, I got to know the wonderful actor Alec Guinness towards the end of his life. You may know him as Obi-Wan Kenobi, but obviously he did many other things too. And he liked to lunch or dine at the Connaught. And I remember I arrived late for a lunch with him, just the two of us. And he was of a generation that didn't tolerate lateness, and quite rightly, but it wasn't my fault as it happens. He said, well, I've been doing the crossword, and you can finish it off for me. And I looked at it and I finished a few off. He said, oh, you're very good at anagrams. And I said, yeah, I've just seen a very good anagram of your name, actually, Alec Guinness. He said, I hope it's not like the one you gave Alan Bates, because I used to call the actor Alan Bates anal beast. I said, no. I said, your name is an anagram of genuine class. Oh. And he said, I'm going to remember you in my will. Which he didn't, but which is a shame because he got a large percentage of all the Star Wars movies because he didn't take a salary when he played Obi-Wan and agreed to take a percentage instead. So they think about 100 million he earned from that, which is not bad. Anyway, so that was the first thing. I discovered language was a marvellous thing at school because despite the fact that all of us have language, if you're listening to me, you're using language as much as I am when I'm speaking. You're processing it, you're understanding it. It's a miracle that nobody truly comprehends where it came from, how it works. But it is the very basis of everything. It seems to be the author of our thoughts. It comes before everything else. Wittgenstein certainly thought so, and it saw its limitations. You could never know the truth because you're always inside language instead, which is a symbolic representation of the truth. Now we're all very concerned about AI, and what are the AI machines called? LLMs, large language models. And these models are all about language. It's how they work in a stochastic way. Well, we won't go into that. But anyway, language is always something that people take for granted. And I noticed that all the other boys in the school just used it for, saying, pass the mustard, oh, fuck off, I hate you, come here, go away. Just basic sort of things, rather than using it in the way that an artist would use paint or a musician would use sounds as something to seduce and beguile and delight and indeed to defend yourself, as a constructor of wit. And so for bullying, for example, I was never bullied because, although people would come to bully me, I discovered this, and you can use it if you happen to have, I don't know, nephews, nieces, well, actually nieces it won't work, but nephews, sons, whatever, who might be bullied at school. This is what you do. The bully comes up and they raise a fist, and you go, no, don't touch me, I'll get an erection. And you go, oh, bloody hell. And then off they go baffled. And so, I sort of thought, I loved Latin and I learned ancient Greek from the age of 8 onwards because I just loved the substitution of different alphabet and things. And it was sort of quite nerdy, but generally it was just joy in words. And they were the only things I had because everyone else had their bodies for sport and dancing, and they had painting and music and so on, and I had none of those. Or indeed maths I didn't really have either. And then there was a Sunday afternoon, a rainy Sunday afternoon in the holidays. I was probably about 12, maybe 13. And there was a film, I turned the television on, and a film had started, and I didn't know what it was. It was set in the past. It wasn't Shakespeare. It wasn't a Jane Austen or a Bonnety sort of thing. But I couldn't quite place it. And the language that was being used was so astonishing that I was in a kind of trance. My mouth just hung open, and I sort of drooled and stared at it. And at one point, a young man kneels in front of this beautiful young girl and says, I hope I shall not offend you if I state quite openly and frankly that you seem to me to be in every way the visible personification of absolute perfection. And I was just like I'd been sandbagged. Mm. You seem to me to be in every way the visible personification of absolute perfection, which is just I laughed because it's so funny. You don't declare love with such ornate language. It's absurd. If you love someone, you just say, I love you. But by doing that, it's an extra gift to someone. Anyway, I ran off to my mother and I said, Mummy, would you be in any way offended if I stated quite openly and frankly that you seem to me to be in every way the visible personification of absolute perfection? And she said, what are you talking about? And I explained what I'd seen. She said, she said, that was the importance of being earnest. I said, oh, what is that? She said, well, it's a play, and they did a film version. That's what you saw. So being in the middle of the country in Norfolk, my only hope, my only lifeline to the world was the mobile library that would chug along the lanes. And I stopped it the following Thursday and got on and asked for a copy of Oscar Wilde and the four comedies, and I learnt The Importance of Being Earnest pretty much off by heart. I still know it more or less off by heart. And then I wanted to know more about the extraordinary person who had written this, and I got hold of a biography, or it was called actually The Trials of Oscar Wilde, and I started to read it, not knowing what was going to happen, and saw that he was a remarkable man, a man who attracted a circle of friends, who was brilliant and kind and warm and full of wit and wonder, and just the most marvellous figure. And then this dark note started to go into the story, and you probably all know it well. And eventually he ended up in court, 3 trials, and in the 3rd trial was sent to prison for 2 years at hard labour for the crime, the love that dare not speak its name, as it was called sometimes in those days, for being a gay man. And he died in Paris afterwards at the age of 46. And I read that, and suddenly my whole world changed, because I saw myself there. I recognized that the impulse is what we call now the sexuality, but he used a rather good word for it. He just said my nature, his nature. His nature was the same as my nature, I could see. And I could see that my future would be like his, one of exile and mockery and scorn and loneliness and hatred and imprisonment or exile or something terrible, because that was the fate that became. Never read about a gay man except it was in a newspaper, and it was a court case, and it was shame. And so I felt simultaneously terrible because I saw this awful future, but I also felt, but then there's this man and he's like me, so I'm not alone. And then I'd cycle into Norwich to the big library, and I would read all about his friends and the whole circle, and I'd read about other writers like him, everyone from E.M. Forster and Somerset Maugham, and then artists and poets and painters. And I realized that actually I had been selected by nature to be a member of a very extraordinary club. It was not a club that was liked by the rest of the world. It was a club that was dangerous to belong to. If you were found out that you were a member of this club, you could go to prison if you acted on your nature. But nonetheless, there was something very precious and extraordinary about the people who were there. They were brave and they were honest, and they changed the colours of the world. They made everything look different. And so I was kind of simultaneously ashamed and proud, which is the sort of thing that tore you apart in those days, the mixture of it. And that all came about really through language, or at least obviously my sexuality didn't, but my confidence that I was in the company of great minds was there. And I wonder to this day, Andrew, if I'd been born 20 years later, 30 years later, I wouldn't have needed to go to the library to find out there were people like me. There were, first of all, there were, sex lines on telephone, there were magazines, there were all kinds of things like that. And of course, then there was the internet. And I would find out people of my nature everywhere. And I could short circuit. I wouldn't have to read all those books. But reading all those books was the most wonderful thing that could possibly have happened to me.
It's funny you mentioning Oscar Wilde, because generationally, of course, we're separate. And I think, I know I've told you this before, when you were filming It's a Sin, I sent you a message about this. But please know, later in 1997, when we would see you playing Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wales Wild, in Wild, brilliantly, I too was a kid, when I was a kid on a council estate, desperately looking during Section 28 for queer role models.
Yes, for validation and...
Well, specifically just someone I wanted to be like,
yes.
And I was never a fit, sporty gay guy. And so the role models I found were in plays, specifically things like Bent by Martin Sherman, hence the pink triangle on my arm. But seeing you as Wilde felt so familiar. And from there, I think I've sent you a picture of it, I bought my Collins complete works of Oscar Wilde and read De Profundis and didn't necessarily understand it all, but understood most of it. And I just think it's so interesting how, thank God for that little library truck trundling down your lane, because you have inspired a generation of people who may not be sporty, but who feel things deeply, who love language, who love difference and intrigue and philosophy. And I didn't have a particularly great father figure, But to see a gay person like you on my television set gave me such enormous inspiration and comfort. And it really is one of the greatest honours of my life to have you in my phone book to go, oh, look, I found this interesting thing. Because my 13-year-old self, who didn't know if he was going to live or die, would never believe it. Speaking of repression, your Jewishness is something that has come in later life that you've become extremely proud of.
Well,
I wonder, at the moment, with all that is happening...
Don't. Yes, Jewishness is fortunately not the same as being an Israeli, thank God. But, of course, it is conflated in some people's minds. And I guess Jewish people are expected to denounce and disavow the horrors of Gaza more than the ordinary citizen is. And I'm happy to do so, to be horrified by that. But also horrified by anti-Semitism on both right and left, which seems to be growing. And yes, I've come... I was never ashamed of being Jewish, but it was never important to me in the sense that I didn't grow up in a household that was in the least bit Jewish conscious or religious, or have Saturday night meals, or go to synagogue, or any of that things. You've probably been to a synagogue more often than I have. I've just, the religious side of it meant nothing to me, and my grandfather and grandmother were what were laughingly called assimilated in Austria and Hungary, and they thought of themselves as just normal citizens, and then they discovered to their cost, or at least the cost of their parents, who all perished in death camps, that they weren't assimilated after all, and they came here, and they weren't interested in telling me all about what it was to be Jewish. They liked the idea that they were now assimilated in English. My grandfather used to wear tweed jackets and shoot in the countryside and things like that, and despite his ridiculous accent, he would, hang out with earls and things like that, and he was a very dear man, and so on. But so for me, being Jewish was just having family with slightly odd accents, and that was about it, really. But then, I suppose, just awareness of the rise of the right over the last 10, 20 years, and being visited by some organisation saying that they'd seen my name in a right-wing magazine, along with Ben Elton and all kinds of writers and other people, saying this is a list of Jews, if this right-wing magazine saying if you see them, push them off the street at least, or something, And they told me about it, and I thought that was rather wonderful. I suppose Jewish people do have to look after themselves, and they read these awful magazines, and they asked if I wanted, security advice and things like that, and I thought, well, I suppose what I thought was... I'm not going to be told I'm a Jew by anti-Semites. I'll stand up and say, yes, I am, on my own first. You know what I mean? It's my Jewishness is not my religion. It's not an affiliation with the State of Israel. It's not anything other than the fact that my grandfather and grandmother were Jewish, on my mother's side only. But that's still enough for me to be a Jew, and I would have gone into the camps if it had been in the 1940s. And so in that sense, but you can't let an anti-Semite say, you're a Jew. And me say, no, I'm not. My grandparents may have been, but I'm not. I don't own it. Well, that's sort of kind of crazy. It's all so peculiar, this whole thing, because Jewishness is rather unlike any other sort of racial distinction. It's not seems to be not a matter of colour. People on, Nazis thought that Jews were not white, but plenty of people on the left think Jews are white, and they're an example of white power and white privilege and so on. And it's not for me to say, really. Genetically, you can say you're Jewish genetically or you're Jewish culturally. It's very strange. I suppose there are ways one can look with a mixture of pride and astonishment at how a small number of Jews have completely changed Western history. And maybe that's some of the... if you take out... they all kind of vaguely roughly overlapped Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, and Albert Einstein, just rewrote the way the world was looked at. History was never the same after Karl Marx, even if you weren't a Marxist. his analysis of capital and of the economics and of work and so on was revolutionary, even if your country didn't follow a Marxist revolution. And Sigmund Freud changed the idea of the self completely. Even if we don't believe every dogma and doctrine of Freudian analysis, we realize that he loosed us from believing there was a single coherent self, and that we were sort of riven apart by different instincts and impulses over which we had no conscious control. And Einstein made the same point about the universe, the relative nature of it, and that the mechanistic explanation of things, this input provides that output, was not good enough, and that something new would happen. And this caused the 20th century to happen in the beginning. It caused modernism, it caused a fracturing of reality, and modern art and poetry and music became fractured because our worldview was now fractured. There was no coherent center to our belief, whether it was a God-driven coherent center or an aristocratic or a society or industry. There was no. Suddenly everything seemed to be, and then the First World War seemed to be almost a result of that, or at least to be a furtherance of this idea of fracture. And you could, there were intellectual Nazis. It seems an oppositional thing to say, just as there are intellectual Trumpians. But there kind of are, they read and quote philosophy and all the rest of it. And some of them directly said that. The Jews are responsible for the world no longer making sense. They have turned everything upside down, and they have made us guilty about everything, made us guilty about ourselves, about history, and even our place in the universe is no longer central or stable. They caused an instability. And one can be rather proud of that, to think one belongs to a people who are capable of such extraordinary upturning of everything, and also slightly bewildered as to how it could have happened.
I want to come back to a little bit of early life.
Yeah.
Now, I want to know, what were the very first roles that you ever played as a little Stephen Fry?
Well, I was wanted to be an actor, and I remember thinking how extraordinarily different people can be when my brother and I would go to pantomimes and Buttons would come on and say, now, are there any boys and girls who want to come up on stage, for the community song and all the rest of it? And my brother would instantly hide under the seat, make noises like a piece of dust so that no one would notice him. And I would thrust my hand up so hard that I would split my armpit, It was just, me. And we both had the same parents. We were both composed of the same genetic, input as well. But somehow we were utterly different. I saw a stage. That's the place to be on it. But for my brother, the idea of it is absolutely, and for most people who are very wise, the idea of being on stage is embarrassing and wrong. But so at prep school, there would be a play every year, and the first one, when I was kind of old enough, I very nearly played Fagin. I could do the dialogue, but when it came to the singing, there was a lot of, oh dear, I'm reviewing. No, Stephen, shut up.
There'll be an offer in the post.
Yeah, exactly. And so I didn't get a good part in Oliver. But the next year, again, the best non-singing part in My Fair Lady, because it was always a bloody musical, was Mrs. Higgins. And that was my first review in it was the Gloucester or the Dursley and Stroud Express or something like that. It was, and a young Stephen Fry plays a Mrs. Higgins who would grace any drawing room. I was so proud. And from then on, the bug was in me. You know that joke about how do you get an elephant off the stage?
How?
You can't. It's in his blood, and it was in my blood. And so then at school, before I started getting expelled from schools too much, I played a witch in Macbeth. And so not very big parts, because I was always so badly behaved. But I would do comedy sketches and things like that more. But then I was expelled from school when I was 15, so I never really got a chance to be properly acting. It wasn't really until I got, after a lot of expulsions and prison and all the interesting adventures of my youth, I got to university. And at Cambridge, there was immense opportunities for drama. Rather counterintuitively, because yes, Yarboo, Cambridge elite, ancient university and so on, but part of its purity in its own mind was that you only did degrees in academic subjects. They'd only recently, that's to say in the last 100 years, accepted English literature as a subject, and that's what I was reading or studying, as you would say now. But the idea you couldn't do drama, good heavens no. So that meant there were no drama teachers, which is the most miraculous escape possible. No twats in scarves going, why
that's
don't
me,
we...
Stephen.
No, you're a director. I'm sure you're not like that at all. Oh, Christ, what have I said? But, at the university, what it meant was there were drama clubs, and each of the colleges had its own drama clubs, and lots of different ones, and you put on plays, and you did... And, of course, it was all... there'd been a tradition of all these directors who'd been students there who'd put these plays on, and you did... in my second term, I was in 8 plays. Wow. And in good parts. If I'd been in a drama school, I would have been cast by the drama teacher, and who knows what I would have been, And so we were all doing all these things to a paying audience, and students were doing the lights and the stage management and the production. It's a big university when you add all the colleges up, the 30-odd colleges, about 300 or 400 students in each one. And so there's a big audience, and you put these plays on, and that's why you get the Trevor Nunn, Peter Hall, Richard Eyre, Nick Heitner, Sam Mendes, all these people went through Cambridge as students and just directed plays all the time. Because the other advantage is Cambridge is so arrogant, as these universities are, that if they accept you, they won't for a minute permit the idea that they made a mistake. So they won't fail you, ever, really. And you don't have to go to lectures or anything like that. And yes, you have these tutor-type people as supervisors, and they set you essays, and you just go, oh, God, I'm still thinking about that. Do you mind if I put it off for 2 weeks? And so you're in a play, aren't you? I go, yes, oh, very well, As long as you turn up and do your final. So I did endless plays at Cambridge. I mean, dozens and dozens. And that was just fabulous. And we go out to Edinburgh, and we won some prizes at Edinburgh, and I'd written a play that was a comedy. And because of that was in my second year. It was a play called Latin. It was a disgraceful play. It's sort of satire on prep schools, really. A girl that I'd made fast friends with at Cambridge, and we were kind of best friends. She came to see it, and she said, next term I'm going to interview you. I'm going to introduce you to someone. Now this girl was the most extraordinary actress I'd seen as a student. She was just breathtaking. The moment she walked on the stage, you went, oh, who is that? And her name was Emma Thompson.
I've heard of her.
And she took me, so the next term she took me around to this. She said, I'm going to introduce you to Hugh. And I said, who's Hugh? She said, well, Hugh Laurie. He's taken over as the head of the president of the Footlights Club, which is the comedy club at Cambridge. And so we went round to his college and knocked on the door. And Hugh's girlfriend, Katie, opened it. And Hugh was sitting on a bed with a guitar. And he looked up and went, hello. And I said, hello. And he said he was writing a song. So I sat next to him, and he played a verse and a chorus of this song. And I added words for a variation of the chorus and another verse. And we finished the song, and then we started writing a sketch. And Emma and Hugh's girlfriend, Katie, just were staring at each other. And they sort of coughed, and we looked up and said, what? And they said, well, you haven't even introduced yourselves to each other. And it was just extraordinary. We kind of fell in love in a comedy sense, it was just an instant fit. And we carried on writing sketches together, and then went to Edinburgh and won the first of the Perrier Awards, which took us to London to do a show. And then the BBC asked if they could put the show on, and then Granada Television in ITV said, do you want to do a series? And they introduced us to someone who'd come down from Manchester University, Ben Elton, who was joining our group, and then someone who'd come down from Art College in Scotland, Robbie Coltrane. And so Hugh, me and Emma and Robbie and Ben did this series and before we knew it, we had equity cards, and I wasn't going to be an academic after all. I assumed I would have stayed at university and quietly grown tweed in a corner somewhere.
Never.
So that's just a compressed version of how acting just took me to these extraordinary places that I had no idea it would. I was so lucky.
With that training, for the actors listening and indeed here in this room, what has been the most helpful lesson in regards to your craft as an actor? Like something that's genuinely been helpful to have as a performer?
I think it's to work with friends. I mean, I do get people writing and asking, I want to be an actor. What's the best way I can do it? And obviously, I'm fully aware of how expensive it is now to go to a drama school if you don't have the money. But so what I say is the only advice I can give is find friends who think like you, who feel like you, who feel this need to do theatre. And if you find enough of you, and you need 4, maybe 5, ideally 6 or 7, but if just that group of you, you will find a pub to do a play in. You will get together and you will do things, and you will have tiny audiences, and you will keep doing it. And you'll find a way to go to Edinburgh, and you will, at the end of 2 years, you will have done so many different plays. You will have done strange, avant-garde pieces from Austria in the 1920s. You will have done things from Chicago, written 6 months earlier. You will do and classics and all kinds of things, and you will have played different roles, playing different genders, doing all kinds of different things. And that experience will give you the confidence. But without it, it's very, very hard, really hard. And I've got nothing against drama schools, really. Obviously, a lot of great actors went to drama school, but I think the real school is doing it. It's just doing it, and it doesn't matter that it's not in a Grand West End theatre. Mm-hmm. It's just it's with friends, because theatre is about a company. The joy of being in a play is with a group of other people, and you're together and you love each other and you drive each other mad, and there's an intensity of emotion that is there, and is there usually in the script of your play, which is what it's about, and it's that coming together of people. You can't do it as I'm an individual, I'll go to this casting and I'll go to this, unless you're extraordinarily talented or extraordinarily good looking or extraordinarily lucky. You just can't get forward that way. It's with other people, I'm convinced.
You spoke about working with your friends and being part of a great ensemble. Perhaps there's no greater example of that in your career than a series called Blackadder.
Oh, yeah.
As you cast your mind back on working within that ensemble, obviously a huge amount of extremely intelligent personalities. How on earth did you get anything done without discussing it too much?
Well, we did over-discuss, there's no question. There's a lot of that. I mean, we would, the modern word would be craft. We would craft jokes. Richard Curtis and Ben Elton would write scripts, and we'd read them on a Tuesday morning, because we had Monday off, because Sunday was the recording day. So we'd gather in the rehearsal rooms at the BBC, and there'd be a new script, and we'd read it. And Rowan would read with his fingers in his ears. Yes, it's a very odd way of reading. And Richard and Ben stopped coming because they found it such a depressing experience, because we'd all be going, is that a joke? I mean, it's just awful. I mean, it was sort of weird feeling of fear, because we just didn't know whether this was any good or not. And because each series was different, and so we were worried the audience would look at it, and if it was the third series, which was set in Regency, England, they'd go, well, where's the Queenie? Where's Miranda Richardson? There's no Queenie here. And they'd have to, the audience wouldn't understand, because it wouldn't have been broadcast yet, so they don't know what they're watching. Or then they'll go, it's now in the First World War. And, we were terribly nervous that they wouldn't like this new iteration. So there was that, and whatever our characters were we sure what they were like, and whether the jokes were good enough. We should have add jokes. So, there would be, that's sort of typical Blackadder epithet, I suppose, is the punchy word for it. So it would be like, Blackadder would say, this is a problem. I will go further. This is a 42-story problem with double glazing, interior carpeting, and a big sign outside saying this is a big problem. And we go, no, that's too elaborate. And then we'd throw that out and do another one. And the producer would be there sort of sitting, sort of sucking a pencil. And the director would be panicking. And, the production assistants would be just shaking their heads and not knowing what was going on, because we'd say, we need this prop. And there would be a prop that wasn't in the script originally that had to be got, because the things were built. And it was a kind of agony, and it was all in the period when everybody was smoking, and so there was just endless smoke and coughing and general despair. But by the time you got to Friday, which is when you had a technical run and all the technical people came, that was sort of in place. But technical runs are nightmarish because you're young and you're insecure, and you think everything you do is people are watching and they're judging you. So you do a comedy scene and they're folding their arms and looking at it like that, completely unamused. I mean, and you think, oh God, they hate us. But of course, what they're actually thinking is, can I get a boom mic in there? Probably not. Because that's their job. They're thinking about the sound, or they're thinking about the design, or which the camera angle they're not there to laugh at you and to be an audience and please and pamper your ego. They're there to do a job. And then sort of eventually, after a few weeks, you'd sort of have a drink with them afterwards in the bar, and they'd say, oh, I love that scene. And you go, so you liked it? Oh, I just thought you hated it. And then they'd explain, no, but when you go to the technical roles, you're not looking at the performance, you're only looking at the set. You know, and you think, oh, of course, duh. But, you know, we're so vain actors. You just think you're being looked at all the time and that's what it's all about. But it was a strange thing because you don't know what people think of it when you're doing it at all. And, you know, you're just hoping it's going to go all right. So it wasn't a sense of, oh, we're in this marvellous hit show kind of thing at all. And in fact, we had an equally lugubriously melancholic group who would be in the studio next to us, which was David Jason and Nick Lyndhurst, who were doing Only Fools and Horses. Yeah. And we'd have competitions about, no, our audience hates us more than your audience. And Nick Lyndhurst, who, like his character Rodney, is this kind of just long, kind of miserable figure. I mean, divine man, but he kind of has an affect of complete misery. So, no, they completely hate me. Every time I open my mouth, they want me to shut up. Okay, no, and it's kind of encouraging to know that there is this. At least you can't accuse them all of the vanity that people assume is part of an actor's armoury. But anyway, no, it was looking back. But this is true of all positive emotions, I'm convinced, as I get older, is that if you're in a golden age or if you're in even a period of happiness, you don't know it at the time. It's only when you go, oh my God, I suppose I was happy back then, wasn't I? You know. In fact, it's a thing I say now as a sort of, if, you know, director comes into the makeup room or something when you're about to go on set and they go, everybody happy? I go, happy. I remember that, something to do with mummy and ice creams a long time ago. Because that's the only time you can ever dare say you were happy, when it's long past. If you say you're happy now, you just know. I think P.G. Woodhouse put it very well, that, you know, it's when you're whistling a happy tune and the sun is shining, that you can be sure fate is lurking around the corner, quietly slipping a horseshoe into the boxing glove.
My experience,
ready
yes.
to bang you like that. Thank you. Yeah. So I don't know what I was answering you there, but yes, no. Blackadder, looking back, was a very happy experience. Though at the time it was one of, you know, acid reflux and stomach ulcers.
Obviously, during the 1980s, there was Blackadder. There was a bit of Hugh Laurie, and of course you were critically acclaimed in Jeeves and Wooster for, 3 years?
Yeah,
I mean, in many ways, when we had, 4 or 5 channels in total, you were...
forced to watch me.
You were, in all fairness, in the 80s, one of the most important faces of comedy. And indeed, there would not have been man, woman or child who did not know who you were.
Yeah.
Did fame bring happiness?
No, I mean, not in and of itself. When I was a teenager, if I'd ever thought I was going to be famous, I would have wriggled with joy at the idea. You know, I used to watch Parkinson and those sort of chat shows and see Peter Sellers or James Cagney or something being interviewed, and they'd sometimes tell stories about being recognised in the street or by a cabbie, and I'd go, oh my God, that must be so exciting. And at first it is. I was very lucky in that I slowly leaked into the public consciousness, rather than, in Lord Byron's phrase, waking up to find myself famous. in the way that people do sometimes in popular music and soap operas and reality TV. They are suddenly very well known, and suddenly they have a driver, and they, you know, this lifestyle and money and being written about in newspapers, and that I think can be psychically rather difficult to cope with. Whereas if it's more, in my case, the boiling frog syndrome. You know that if you put a frog in cold water and turn the heat up, it'll stay there and be boiled. Whereas if you put a frog into boiling water, it'll hop out because it's hot. Ow! But I was slowly heated up, which was both good and bad. It meant that I don't think it ever sent me sort of stupid. It's a bit like, I always say it's a picnic being well known, really. It's an absolute picnic. You get lovely tables at lovely restaurants, and you get to meet a lot of your heroes and get invited to interesting things, whether it's, I don't know, the Royal Box at Wimbledon or whatever it might be that happens to float one's boat. It's a privilege. But like a lot of picnics, there will be wasps. And sometimes there are so many of them, they drive you back into the house, and the wasps take the form of the media and social media and paparazzi and so on, that can be a little bit tiresome, especially for those around you. So for my husband or whatever, it's just horrible if we get pressed in by fans, even, really, because I mean, he copes with it very well, but it's I always think the worst thing is to be a spouse or partner of a well-known person, because you get elbowed out the way. I mean, it's awful what people will do. They want to get you to have a selfie or something, and they'll just elbow people out of the way, not knowing who they are. And it's sort of rude. But if I were to snap at them and say, "Don't you dare," they think, "Oh, he's up himself, isn't he?" And then that's the other thing is, of course, you do have to be very cheerful all the time, or at least look cheerful, because you know what it's like when you're in a supermarket and you're in the queue and you're in a bit of a hurry, and there's someone in front of you who, an old lady who is obviously staggered to discover that you have to bring out a wallet or something or a card in order to pay. And so she just suddenly picks up a bag and goes, "You get on with it." But you can't do that, because if you look as if you're pissed off, you know that someone will look at you and say, "Oh, he expects to be served first because he's famous," or "Oh, he thinks that he does." You know what I mean? You have to have this sort of grin on your face all the time. Everything's absolutely fabulous, because otherwise, if you're just in a bad mood, I saw that Stephen Fry. What a misery! Oh, he's such a misery. He looked so pissed off. So you have to guard against that.
I want to go from that rather joyous remark to an extremely challenging part of your life, when you were doing a production of Cellmates.
Yeah.
That period in the 1980s, it was clear that money, fame, notoriety had come your way. What we didn't cover was how you'd had a hit West End musical, Me and My Girl, in the West End for 8 years, that went to Broadway and Tony nominated. Absolutely, extraordinary career.
Yeah.
And yet, of course, throughout all of that, not only would you later have a mental health diagnosis, but you were in active addiction, specifically with cocaine.
Yeah.
There are so many actors, and indeed myself as somebody in recovery for various alcohol and drug addictions, there are so many of us in the performing arts that believe that cocaine will open a doorway, that will give us a release, that will somehow help us in the entertainment industry, and indeed when it comes to LGBTQ plus people dealing with shame, often using chemicals to deal with an emotional and trauma imbalance. Can you take your mind back, if you're comfortable, to that whole process and where it took you, and just share that story and what you learned by the end of it?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's looking back. At the time, I wouldn't have agreed or considered any of this, I don't think. But looking on the long stretch of my life from university onwards, which was a period of intense work for 8, 9, 10 years, and I was also completely celibate. Afraid of relationships, but also just feeling they would get in the way of my work. And it just so happened that the year I left university, 1981, was the year that people started talking about this strange gay illness that had arrived from America, and no one quite knew what it was. It was called GRID to begin with, gay-related immune deficiency. Then became known as AIDS, of course, and there was a hysteria about it, and I started going to funerals of friends from university, people my age and younger, and seeing their parents devastated. And so, of course, this mixture of just wanting to work and not believing that I could ever be desirable, because, you know, friends would say, oh, go on, let's go to heaven, so I go to heaven or some nightclub, and you go through the door, and then just all you see is eyes raking you up and down, and then turning away. You just feel so rejected. And I just constantly thought, no one is going to be even vaguely interested in me. And anyway, I'm not really interested in places where there's just banging music all the time. I can't dance. I look an idiot if I dance. I'm wearing a tweed jacket. Why would I dance? And all I wanted to do was talk to people. And, you know, and there's no one's talking, and the music's too loud. And I can't bear it. And so I was very anti the scene at the time. And just plus the fact that, you know, it was so dangerous with this incurable, fatal 100% deadly disease as it was then. So for 10 years, as I say, I was just living and working, and I guess my engine was thrashing, but I wasn't really getting further forward emotionally or in any spiritually or in any personal way. I was just working. And I thought that was all I ever wanted to do, and that was enough. And it somehow wasn't. And also, I am, by nature, very homebody sort of person. I fall asleep at 9:30 in the evening and wake up very early and go for a walk and listen to the birds singing. And I'm not a natural party animal at all. I don't like parties. But then when I was introduced to the devil's dandruff, I found that it made me like parties. It made me like being out late at night. It meant if I was in a play, I was in a play by Simon Gray, called The Common Pursuit with Rick Mayall and John Sessions and others, and that's when I really started using this stuff. And I would go to the Limelight, the nightclub in Shaftesbury Avenue afterwards. It had a sort of VIP place where there were all kinds of famous people whose names I obviously cannot give to you here. And there was an all-night cafe on Kingly Street, parallel with Regent Street, which was, again, some unbelievably famous rock stars and actors and things would gather there in the office, and you'd have the longest line competitions and things like that. I mean, absolutely just awful. You should march along a table. just awful. I know I'm scratching my nose now as a reflex. It's terrible. And so I hardly slept, but I was a party person, and I would stay up late and get up late and felt like I kind of belonged to London's nightlife, and the Groucho Club and all these other places were open, and there would be all-night card sessions with certain groups of people that I would see, and we all had in common this coke fiend impulse and the alcohol that went with it, and the fact that you were just constantly running and you never stopped to question things. But then a crash came. I was in this play, but by the same playwright had been in Common Pursuit, wrote a play really for me called Cellmates, and it was about George Blake, the spy, who was in prison with an Irish fellow, and they managed to escape, and he escaped and went back to Russia. I say back to Russia, he was British, but he went to Russia. And it was about this relationship between Rick Mayall played the Irish fellow, and I was George Blake. And one weekend, it was a Sunday, I don't know, in the words of St. Paul in the Acts of the Apostles, the scales fell from my eyes. And somehow I just saw that my life was completely wrong, and that I was, in the way I thought of it, I was just a failure. I had failed at everything that mattered. I'd failed in love, I'd failed in being a proper person, I'd failed in self-control, I'd failed to understand myself, I was given the most easy ride anyone could possibly have, and I had screwed it up, and I was worth nothing. And it was a moment of beautiful clarity and terrible horror, and I realized I could have nothing whatever to do anymore with my old life. At least that's what I thought. So I got in a car, and actually I pathetically tried to start the car in a closed garage in order to end my life, but there was a catalytic converter, and the carbon monoxide didn't seem to do anything to me. So after about an hour of trying to fall asleep with the engine running, I thought, sod it, so drove off to to Folkestone and got a ferry to Belgium and to Zeebrugge, and then drove, and I drove through Germany. And I imagined this was 1993, February 1993. And I kind of imagined I pictured I'd go all the way out the top of Denmark, and I'd buy a large white woolen sweater and a pipe, and sit on a rock and write poetry and maybe teach English or something and be forgotten about, and that it would all be okay. But that would be my reinvented life. And I got as far as, I went to Hamburg, and then I got as far as Hanover. And I went to the railway station in Hanover, not to get a train, because I had my car, but to buy something, cigarettes or whatever it was. And then there was a whole line of British newspapers. And I was on the front page of every one of them. And I just thought there would be an arts column in the corner saying strange disappearance of actor or something. But instead there were police on the roof of my house in Norfolk looking for things, and I'd obviously thought the worst. And I had left a note, and it was rather desperate, and I realized looking at it now it looked like a suicide note, and it was a suicide to my old life, but not to my whole life, at least. At least I don't know. I was in such a state I couldn't be sure.
What did it say? Can you remember what?
I'm a failure, and I'm so sorry, and you're to forget all about me, and that sort of thing. And
what was your intention when you wrote that?
I think my intention was either to end my life or to go. As I say, I started the car in the garage, and maybe if I'd fallen asleep and died, that would have been what I intended. But instead, I just drove off and forgot about the note, to be honest. So this was there was no World Wide Web. But I was always a nerd, and I'd been online on commercial online servers, as they were called then. And Hugh got in touch with me on one. He said, I've learned how to use CompuServe just so I can tell you to come the fuck home. Or at least phone me, or phone your father, or phone someone, you know. And I thought, oh God, this is awful. I didn't realize how worried everyone would be. I hadn't thought, of course they were worried. And so I vaguely put out feelers. My father flew over to, by this time I drove back as far as Amsterdam. My father flew to, we met in Schiphol airport, and I was so scared because I hadn't realized how the press interest was phenomenal. So I hired a private plane. I know this, talk about first world problems. I hired a private plane.
We've all done it.
Yeah, we've all done it. To take me to Southend Airport, where I was met by a car so that the press wouldn't sort of see me arriving. And then, and people were unbelievably kind. I mean, an amazing number of people wrote to me. David Cornwell, as his friends call him, but better known as the novelist John le Carré, arranged an escape for me. He told me how to get to the West Indies, where he knew someone who had a boat, who knew someone who went take me to an island. I didn't take him up on the offer, but he wrote me this fabulous letter, like a spy letter, just telling one how to do these secret things. And John Cleese lent me his house in Santa Barbara for 6 months, really. And I went there and kind of recovered and saw a therapist when I was there. And that was very helpful. Then I went back and carried on seeing one. I actually saw a psychiatrist in London and began the adventure of discovering that I had what was clear to them and it never occurred to me. I had an illness. I had carried this illness for some time, and it explained a great deal. And that illness is called bipolar disorder, and I'm sure most of you know what that is, and some of you, of course, will have it as a disorder, as a companion, devil, angel, friend, and that set me on a path to at least forgiving myself for the ridiculousness of my behaviour in all regards, really, and realising that things needn't be hopeless, that an illness is not a moral failing, and it's easy to believe when you fuck things up that it's a moral failing, that you have failed as a person in some way. You have failed in your duty of honour and decency and doing the right thing. You've been either lazy or selfish or narcissistic or in some way, and you can punish yourself with that. It's not to say one shouldn't recognise when one has misbehaved, because one doesn't forgive oneself for things that are unforgivable, for being unkind, for being cruel, for ignoring people, for dismissing people, for being short-tempered or whatever. Those are things that we're all guilty of sometimes, and that we can correct, because there is no excuse for that. It doesn't matter. I've seen people who are staggeringly ill who have no self-pity at all and are always kind to others. So, there is no circumstance in which you can justify being unpleasant, but there are circumstances you can forgive yourself for being unpleasant to yourself.
That's the hardest thing, though, isn't it?
It is the hardest thing, yeah.
Looking back at your exceptional Moab is my washpot, you talk so passionately and beautifully and obsessively about love.
Yes.
I wonder, this need for drugs, need for an audience, is that in any way connected to a form of love addiction, do you think?
Well, I think all addiction, or all needs are a sublimation of the need for love, in a sense. I mean, you can be quite biological about it if you fuse love and the need to bond and mate in the way that certain mammals do, that we are constructed in order to achieve a bonding with another fellow human of the same or of different sex. And that is an impulse in us. It's a need that drives almost everything to do with this. How we look, how we behave, how we perceive other people as threats or not threats. So whether we fight like stags rutting, and whether we sort of do a courtly dance around the person we want to mate with or bond with, because mating is one thing, but of course it's bonding that we are like certain birds and certain other mammals, and indeed certain other, even fish. They bond. They bond for life sometimes, and the need to do it is a primal impulse within us all. And the other needs that we feed ourselves with are, I think, yes, a subset of that primal need. And if we're not servicing the need to love and be loved, yes, both, obviously.
Thank you. I'm afraid that is the end of part one. For our audience here at the Two Brewers, we'll now be taking a 15-minute interval, so please do grab yourself a drink at the bar. For those tuning in from home, backstage, or perhaps even in the bath, make sure you're subscribed to the Show People podcast to be notified as soon as part two with Stephen Fry is released. Sorry, Sir Stephen Fry.
Honestly, just Sir is fine.
Oh, I know. We would like to extend our gratitude to our extraordinary sponsors, to Theatre Counts, the entertainment industry's trusted accountants, looking after thousands of clients across theatre and performance. Connect with them at theatrecounts.co.uk or at theatrecounts on social media. Jake Waby Productions, London's experts in theatre and live performance videography, capturing your stories just the way you want them. From West End shows to global content, their experienced team delivers exceptional cinematic storytelling. A huge thank you to the Two Brewers, Jimmy Smith, Rhys Godfrey, Adam Deemer, and all the glorious staff. This podcast is produced by Queer Theatre, committed to telling LGBTQ+ stories and nurturing queer talent. If you've enjoyed this podcast and you'd like to support our work, please consider making a donation at queertheatre.co.uk. You'll also discover details of our weekly acting classes for LGBTQ+ people, the Queer Play Reading Club, showcases, networking events, parties, and masterclasses. If you're queer, come and be a part of our community. And if you're not, come and be an ally and support our shows, like coming to see the Show People podcast live. Finally, please put your hands together for the one, the only, Sir Stephen Fry.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Until next time, love always.
Oh.